everyone, and welcome to the Deep Dive. So today we're going to tackle something a lot of you have been asking about, anxiety in the modern world. We've got some awesome sources to help us break it all down.
I'm excited to dive in.
Me too. Okay, so we've got this super in-depth article called Anxiety in the Modern World, Coping Strategies and Resources.
Sounds promising.
Yeah, and then we've got another one on the causes and effects. It's called Understanding Anxiety, More Than Just Everyday Worries. And to top it all off,
Yeah,
we've got this really fascinating series by an expert, Dr. Rosmarin, called Thriving with Anxiety.
Thriving with anxiety, that's an interesting concept.
Right, like usually it's all about getting rid of anxiety, but this is like flipping the script.
Yeah, turning it on its head.
Exactly. And that's kind of what we're going for with this deep dive, not just throwing a bunch of information at you, but actually giving you some actionable knowledge and tools to work with.
I like that. Make it practical.
Totally. And there's this one idea from Dr. Rosmarin that just blew my mind, that anxiety can actually be a strength.
That is fascinating, isn't it? To think that anxiety might not be something we need to just like squash, but could actually work for us.
I know, right? Okay, so where should we start with all of this?
Maybe with the basics.
Yeah, good idea. Like, how do we even define anxiety in this crazy, always-on world? I mean, we all get stressed about deadlines and, life stuff, but when does it actually cross the line into something more serious?
Right. Understanding anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
They use this really helpful analogy of a boiling pot.
Okay, boiling pot.
Yeah, imagine your mind is that pot on the stove.
Mm.
Normal worry is like the water simmering, just kind of bubbling a bit. But anxiety is when that heat gets cranked up and the
Right.
water's boiling over and you can't control it anymore.
Oh, I see. So it's like it's taking over.
Yeah, and it starts to impact your everyday life.
Okay, I get that. But it's like, haven't things always been stressful? Why is anxiety such a modern problem?
It's not just about stress, but how we experience it. Think about we're constantly bombarded with notifications. There's pressure to be on all the time. Work demands creeping into every free moment.
It never ends.
It really doesn't.
Yeah.
And anxiety in the modern world, they talk about how all this modern pressure, especially the digital kind, keeps that metaphorical stovetop burning on high all the time.
So it's not that our brains are like wired differently now. It's that the world is kind of designed to make us anxious.
In a way, yes. I
Mm.
mean, everyday worries are normal. But when that worry turns into constant fear or keeps you from doing things you need or want to do, that's a sign it might be something more.
Okay, so how do we figure out what's causing all this anxiety?
Well, understanding anxiety breaks it down into internal and external factors.
Like what's going on inside us versus outside of us?
Exactly. Internally, it could be your genetics, brain chemistry, even certain personality traits that make you more prone to anxiety.
So some of us are just predisposed to worry more.
It's possible. But it's not all about what's going on in our heads. External factors play a huge role, too. Think about job stress, financial pressure, that never-ending to-do list, relationship problems, even just the pressure to live up to what society expects of us.
Yeah, all of that definitely contributes to feeling overwhelmed.
For sure. It's like a perfect storm of internal and external factors colliding. But it's not just about feeling stress. What's the actual impact of anxiety on our bodies and our lives?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, what does it actually do to us?
That's where it gets really interesting and a little bit scary. Understanding anxiety. They don't sugarcoat it. Anxiety affects us on multiple levels, physically, mentally, even how we behave.
Okay, hit me with the details.
So physically, you might experience a racing heart, muscle tension, headaches, that feeling of carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders.
Yeah, I know that feeling.
And then mentally, you might find it hard to concentrate. You might have racing thoughts, insomnia, even an increased risk of things like depression and panic disorders.
Wow, it's like a domino effect. But how do you know if it's just normal stress or if it's something more serious?
It's about the intensity and frequency. Occasional stress is part of life, but if these physical and mental symptoms are constant, or if they interfere with your daily life, that's a sign it might be more than just stress.
Okay, and what about behaviorally? How does anxiety affect the way we act?
Well, it can lead to social avoidance, make you withdraw from friends and family. It can make you irritable and snappy, which obviously impacts relationships. It can even make you less productive at work as those anxious thoughts take over. Really, it can touch every aspect of our lives.
This is all a bit heavy. So what about Dr. Rosmarin's idea that anxiety can actually be a strength? Tell me more about that.
Okay, let's switch gears. Remember that analogy of a boiling pot? What if we could control that heat? What if we could use that boiling energy to power something amazing? That's what Dr. Rosmarin's work is all about.
So instead of trying to turn off the stove, we learn to use the heat.
Exactly. He challenges us to see that anxiety isn't inherently bad. It's powerful energy. And if we can harness it correctly, it can actually fuel our success.
Okay, now you've got my attention. But how do we even begin to do that? I mean, my anxiety usually feels like it's working against me, not for me.
I know what you mean. But what's fascinating is that even when we feel overwhelmed, that anxious energy is often a sign that something important is happening. Maybe it's pushing us to reach a goal or speak up for ourselves or to make a change that we've been putting off. It's like a built-in alarm system. But instead of running from it, we can learn to listen to what it's trying to tell us.
So how do we go from feeling hijacked by our anxiety to actually being in the driver's seat?
That's what we're going to unpack next. It's about understanding those internal and external factors, recognizing the ways anxiety shows up in our lives, and then building a toolkit of strategies to help us not just manage it, but use it to our advantage.
Okay, I'm definitely ready for that toolkit. We'll be right back after a quick break to dive into some practical strategies for understanding and harnessing the power of anxiety. All right, so before the break, we were talking about this wild idea that anxiety might not be the enemy, but like a source of energy we can actually tap into. It's a lot to wrap your head around. Did you always see anxiety this way?
Honestly, no, not at first. Like a lot of people, I used to see anxiety as something purely negative, something to be avoided or medicated away.
Yeah, for sure.
But as I kind of dove deeper into the research, particularly Dr. Rosmarin's work, my perspective started to shift. I realized that anxiety is way more nuanced than we give it credit for.
So what changed your mind? How did you go from seeing it as this monster under the bed to a potential ally?
It's actually a personal experience. I was preparing for this big presentation, and I was so anxious. My heart was racing, palms sweating. I couldn't sleep. It felt like my anxiety was going to completely sabotage the whole thing.
Oh, I know that feeling all too well. So what did you do? Did you try to like calm down, meditate, take a chill pill?
Funny you should mention that. I tried all those things, but the anxiety just kept building. And then I came across Dr. Rosmarin's analogy of anxiety as a superpower.
As a superpower.
Yeah. At first I was skeptical, but I decided to give it a try. I started to pay attention to the messages my anxiety was sending me.
So you like talk to your anxiety.
Not literally, of course,
Yeah.
but I started asking myself, what is this anxiety trying to tell me? What am I afraid of? What do I need to do to feel more prepared?
That's really interesting. And what did you discover?
Well, it turned out that my anxiety was actually highlighting some gaps in my preparation. I hadn't practiced my presentation enough, and I was worried about getting tough questions from the audience. So instead of seeing my anxiety as a weakness, I used it as fuel to work harder. I spent extra hours rehearsing. I came up with strong answers to potential questions, and I even visualized myself delivering a confident, engaging presentation.
So you basically like turned that anxious energy into super productive energy?
Exactly. And the result? The presentation was a huge success. I felt confident, energized, even excited to share my work. And that experience totally changed my understanding of anxiety. It showed me that even though it can feel uncomfortable, anxiety can also be a powerful motivator if we learn to work with it.
Okay, that makes sense for like a high stakes situation, like a presentation. But what about the everyday anxieties, the ones that just kind of pop up unexpectedly and make life feel harder? How do we harness those?
Well, that's where Dr. Rosmarin's framework of acceptance and reframing comes in. In his book, Thriving with Anxiety, he argues that the first step is to acknowledge our anxiety, to recognize that it's a normal human emotion, and to stop fighting against it.
So it's kind of like making peace with that inner critic.
Exactly. Not trying to silence it, but understanding where it's coming from.
Yeah.
And once we've accepted our anxiety, we can start to reframe it. Instead of seeing it as a sign of weakness, we could view it as a signal that something important is happening. It might be alerting us to a potential threat, or urging us to protect our boundaries, or motivating us to step outside of our comfort zone.
So instead of getting swept away by the anxiety, we can step back and say, okay, what's going on here? What is this feeling trying to tell me?
Exactly. It's about shifting from a reactive state to a proactive one. Instead of just trying to numb or escape the anxiety, we can use it as a compass to guide us towards growth and positive change. And this brings us to a really crucial point: the power of boundaries.
Boundaries. How does that tie into anxiety?
Well, Dr. Rosmarin emphasizes that anxiety often arises when our boundaries are being crossed, whether it's in our relationships or our work, or even our own internal dialogue. It's like our inner alarm system is going off, signaling that something's not right.
So if I'm feeling anxious about a social event, it might be because I'm overcommitted and need to say no more often.
Exactly. And if you're feeling anxious about a work project, it might be because you're taking on too much responsibility and need to set some limits.
Okay, I see.
It's all about recognizing the connection between your anxiety and your boundaries. Once you start paying attention, you'll probably notice patterns. Maybe you feel most anxious when you're around certain people or in certain situations, or when you're neglecting your own needs. That anxiety is valuable data. It's telling you where you need to create stronger boundaries to protect your energy and well-being.
Okay, so we're talking about acceptance reframing and boundaries, but all of this still feels a bit abstract.
Mhm.
What are some concrete things we can do to actually harness this anxious energy in our daily lives? I mean, how do we go from feeling overwhelmed to actually feeling empowered?
That's a great question, and it's what we'll dive into next. We'll explore specific tools and techniques for managing anxiety in the moment, channeling that energy into positive action, and ultimately building a more resilient and fulfilling life.
Okay, I'm ready for that. We'll be right back after a quick break to explore those practical strategies and put this anxiety superpower to work.
Welcome back to the deep dive. So we've spent this whole deep dive talking about understanding anxiety and its causes, and we've even started to think about it as like a potential source of energy.
Yeah, it's a whole new way of looking at it, isn't it?
It really is. So now for the big question, what do we actually do with all this anxious energy? Like, how do we make it work for us instead of against us?
Well, the good news is that we don't have to just be victims of our anxiety.
Mm.
There are actually tons of tools and techniques out there that can help us manage those feelings and even use them to our advantage.
Okay, that's good to hear. So where do we start?
Well, one of the most powerful tools and something Dr. Rosmarin really emphasizes in his work is mindfulness.
Mindfulness. But isn't that about like calming down? How does that help us harness energy? I know it might seem a bit counterintuitive, right?
Mm.
But think of it this way. Mindfulness allows us to step back from those anxious thoughts and feelings and just observe them without judgment. It creates a little bit of space between us and that storm raging inside.
Oh, so it's not about making the storm disappear, but like learning to weather it.
Exactly. It's like if you're caught in a sudden downpour, you can either panic and get totally soaked and miserable, or you can find shelter, put on a raincoat, and wait for it to pass. Mindfulness is like that shelter, that raincoat. It helps us ride those waves of anxiety without getting totally swept away.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about after the storm passes? Like, how do we actually use that energy?
Well, that's where channeling comes in. Once we've created some space through mindfulness, we can start to direct that energy towards something positive. One of the simplest but most effective ways to do that is by setting really clear goals.
So, like, if I'm anxious about a deadline at work, instead of letting that anxiety just paralyze me, I could break down the project into smaller steps and focus on one at a time.
Exactly. It's about shifting from feeling overwhelmed to feeling empowered. By setting clear, achievable goals, we can take that anxious energy and make it a force for productivity and progress.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this works. We acknowledge the anxiety, create space with mindfulness, and then use that energy to take action. But what about when the anxiety is triggered by something outside of our control, like a really difficult situation at work or a conflict with someone we care about?
That's where boundaries are so important. Remember how we were saying that anxiety can often be a sign that our boundaries are being crossed?
Yeah.
So once we know where those boundaries are, we can start setting some healthy limits to protect ourselves.
So if I'm constantly feeling anxious about like pleasing a really demanding friend, I might need to have a conversation about setting some boundaries.
Exactly. It's not just about saying no, though. It's about prioritizing your own needs, communicating clearly and assertively, and creating a space where you feel safe and respected. And sometimes that might even mean taking a step back from certain people or situations that are constantly triggering that anxiety.
I love that. It's like you're giving us permission to actually use our anxiety as a guide to create a happier, more authentic life.
That's exactly it. It's all about realizing that anxiety isn't our enemy. It's just a part of being human. And it can actually be a source of creativity and resilience and even joy if we learn to understand it and work with it.
This has been amazing. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us into the world of anxiety.
My pleasure.
We hope this deep dive has given you some helpful insights and practical tools to start harnessing the power of anxiety. And if you want to learn more, be sure to check out the full sources we talked about today. There's so much more to discover.
Absolutely.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.